G'day and welcome to the Drive Able podcast. I'm Brad Williams, and today I'm doing the Drive Able podcast by myself. Unfortunately, Ali is unavailable to join us, but that's not going to stop us bringing you a great interview, and today is no exception. Today we're talking about making the decision to move to hand controls, and our guest today is Lynton Haggett. Lynton sustained a spinal cord injury. He's had it over his lifetime, but between L5 and S1 and in about 2010, his function deteriorated. Um, he's been able to return to drive. Um, by using hand controls. And what we're going to do today is talk to him about the decision and the emotions and unpack what he went through to move from using his feet on the pedals to driving with hand controls. I can't wait to get into this interview. There's a lot of things to unpack about making this decision, and there's going to be a lot of things that a lot of drivers can learn from Lynton's story. So let's get it underway.
Welcome to the Drive Able podcast, where each episode you get to listen to two of Australia's leading professionals in the area of driving and community mobility for people with disabilities. In each episode, they interview drivers, carers, and industry experts and share the insider's guide to driving with a disability. Here are your hosts, Brad and Ollie.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm really excited to get into today's interview. But before we get started, we just want to do a quick shout out to our sponsors who make this show possible, Mobility Engineering and Williams OT. This show takes a lot of time and money to put together. So we just want to say a thanks to our sponsors that bring you the podcast today. And today we've got Lynton. Lynton, thanks very much for joining us. How are you today?
Yeah, very well, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, oh, it's an absolute pleasure, and I can't wait to get into the questions. But the first question we ask everybody is to introduce yourself a little bit and give us a little bit about your background and the disability that you live with every day.
Yeah, sure. So I guess for me, I had a pretty normal life all the way up until I was about 30 or so. I was born with a congenital defect in my spine, and when I was very young, they went in and did an operation to fuse everything and make everything stable, and said that that would be good to go for the rest of my life, pretty much. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. By the time I started to get to about 30 years old, it started to wear out a bit. Left me one good disc at the bottom of my spine, and yeah, that was very tired by around about 2010. But I had, up until that time, I had pretty well normal function, just had not much flexibility in my lower back since the whole thing was fused. Um, and then, yeah, one day I was moving house, lifting some boxes, and I woke up the next day and had some pretty severe weakness in my left leg. Went to the doctor, and they sort of referred me on, and very quickly, within like a week, I think I was getting surgery to fuse that disc that had collapsed and relieve the pressure on some nerves. Um, and it bounced back pretty well. I had a bit of foot drop after that, but that was sort of like my first introduction to disability and lifelong changes to my body. And from there, since 2010, it's gradually worsened now to the point where it's affecting both of my lower limbs. And it was at around 2020 where my right foot at that time was pretty good. But the left was quite severely affected, and I had to start really thinking about making changes in my life. And yeah, by the time I got to about 2022, it was time to start thinking about hand controls.
All right. Well, let's just talk about driving before you had to make that decision. How were you? Did you get your driving license when you were 16, 17-year-old?
Yeah,
And what was
yeah.
driving like right up until you had to make this decision?
Yeah, driving for the bulk of my life was very normal. And yes, you're absolutely right. I got my license when I was about 15 or 16. Really enjoyed it, the freedom that it afforded me, especially as a young lad and all that sort of stuff. And I guess, yeah, took it for granted, really, up until it started to get things that started to get a little bit iffy. And the problem for me was that it was proprioception, so knowing where my lower limbs were. That was the main issue. So I sort of had set up a bit of a system for myself that I felt pretty confident with and everything, and I knew, I could tell where my feet were based on, if I would tap against the side of, the footwell sort of thing, that I would be over the accelerator and all that sort of stuff. And I felt really confident with it, or at least I thought I did. But driving at night was definitely iffy, and because just not having any sense of where they are visually at all, I ended up using, I guess, a few different things to help me get around. And it wasn't until, sorry, yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say that's really interesting. Can we just go back and unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, sure.
You're saying that nighttime driving was more difficult. I mean, I guess what's going through my head is that you look at the road. Were you looking down at your feet? Were you using peripheral vision to get a sense of where your knee was? Can you unpack what the difference between day and night was?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. So I guess when it started to sort of happen, I had to like look down a little bit, like just glancing down. But I got to a point where it was just enough to use my peripheral vision and just have a sense of where my feet were. That was sort of because I do have some sensation in my feet. It wasn't like they were totally like numb or anything like that. So I found that little bit of input that I got from my peripheral vision and the sense that I did have in my right foot was enough to feel quite confident driving during the day. But at night, when I couldn't rely on vision at all and just purely had to go by sense and familiarity with the vehicle and that sort of thing, yeah, it was trickier. And I even got to the point where I had a little rechargeable lamp, and I would put that down in the footwell,
Oh, wow.
and turn that on, and that would be enough to help me drive at night.
So in the using touch and sense that you did have, you would whack the sidewall of the car to know
hmm
that you're over the accelerator.
hmm
What did you use for brake sensation? Was there anything that you could use for brake sensation, or was that a bit more guesswork?
Yeah, that was the tricky one because there was no sort of feedback around the pedal itself. So
Mhm.
that was pretty much like in the car that I drive, it's got like a hole in the steering wheel right over the brake pedal. So basically, that was kind of like almost like gun sights, like I could kind of see that in my periphery and know that that was where I needed to go. Yeah, but yeah, it wasn't until I started to, I guess, explore the option of hand controls that I was like, okay, I feel quite anxious about driving. I
Mhm.
didn't really realize that was there, and I started to diminish the use of the vehicle a bit because of that reason. But yeah.
So we see a lot of people as an occupational therapist with what's classified as peripheral neuropathy, which is hard for me to get my tongue around, getting all those F's and R's working together. But that's where the lower limbs lose sensation, and there's a multitude of conditions that cause that, whether it's a spinal injury at L5S1, or whether it's a general deterioration of the nerves, or whether there's other conditions like diabetes or so forth that cause that kind of thing. So this interview this is why we wanted to get Lynton on, because one, you talk beautifully, and two, we wanted to unpack this decision of how to talking through how you were driving, but then also making that decision about it, and then also talking to you about the emotional elements of that
Mm,
and what it's like now. Were those emotions that you went through, were they validated? Were
mhm,
they accurate? And were they what's it like now? So let's start to get into that side of it all.
mhm.
In regards to when you were saying that your feet were getting a bit iffy and the driving aspect was getting a bit iffy, what kind of emotions were at play at that point? Did you think that driving's off the table? How did you go through this part of your decision making at that point when you're starting to go, oh, this is not quite right now?
Yeah, it was. it's been an interesting journey, and the thing for my condition was because it's a deteriorative condition or a deteriorating condition. It I've go through these periods where I have like a baseline of how everything's working and how functional I am, and then I'll have a slip and my condition will worsen and my symptoms will, worsen. And then I have to go through, I guess, an emotional and like cognitive process almost of like mourning that change. And so it's always, as those changes sort of happen, it's always like a bit of catch up, like emotionally, cognitively, what this means, what changes do I need to make, and those sorts of things. So it was really, really hard for a while, for quite a few years as that happened, and I would have to catch up and do all that sort of thing. And the driving one was a big one, like when I started to realize, okay, this is starting to get, potentially dangerous. What do I need to do? And started to, engage with Williams OT, and other professionals basically to get some input. And I was at a point where I was still relatively comfortable driving, um, but I knew that I had to get onto it quick because basically everyone that I engaged with and asked about was like, and by that time I'd had about 2 years of NDIS experience, and I was like, whatever it has to come here with hand controls, it's going to take time. So I need to get on it, because otherwise I'm going to reach a point probably where I won't be able to drive while I'm waiting for it all to happen. And that was very, I guess, a source of anxiety for me. So that was a real driver to get onto it. Yeah.
We've got a real specific question about NDIS because we always like to unpack NDIS because it really has changed the disability landscape over the recent years, and it's going to continue to change as we move into the future as funding changes and they start playing with the costs and budgets and things like that. But
Mm.
so we'll come back to that in a little bit. When you press the go button on referring yourself for an assessment,
hmm
what anxieties, what thoughts, what emotions were running through you at that point of time?
I think it was just probably at the time the biggest marker that I had that there were pretty significant changes going on in my body. So, sometimes, it's a thing that's shifting over time. And when a big thing comes up like that, it's just sort of, I guess, like a bit of a yardstick and something to sort of anchor, your feelings to a little bit. And it was just, I guess, a bit of a wake up call, that, yeah, I needed to make some changes, to be able to live my life and have my independence, which is very, very important for me. Um,
Had you done
but
some research? Had you
yeah, I'd done
looked
a bit of
into what were the
Googling and
yeah?
yeah, looking at the options that were available and those sorts of things. And I didn't really have a good sense of what it might be like. I was like, well, I play a lot of video games, so I should be okay with it, I guess. Um, but then, yeah, it wasn't until I got in the car to actually give it a test that, yeah, that was interesting.
So let's unpack that bit. Was it a relief? Was it oh my God, there's a lot to learn? Oh, this is natural. I wish I continued, or was it better, or was it worse? Or talk to me about what actually then happened in regards to your thought processes when you actually gave a set of hand controls a go
Mhm.
compared to your legs.
So I guess the first thing was just like being presented with like a puzzle or a cognitive challenge to unpack. So that took my full engagement basically. The worry that I had about it and the anxiety and stuff like that went away because it was just like, okay, this is something that I've got to concentrate on and work on. And I always liken that first experience of trying out hand controls to basically being like 15 or 16 again, and learning to drive. Thank God, I was familiar with road rules and everything, so I didn't have to worry about that. It was just the mechanics of actually driving the vehicle. But yeah, it very much felt like that. And yeah, there was some real mental gymnastics going on to, yeah, get that sort of like new conditioning and everything, so that it was, yeah, very familiar to me.
I know that a lot of people that have a neuropathy of the lower limbs, their legs still work, so their
Hmm.
brain's still connected to their legs.
Hmm.
Did you find it hard to turn off your legs and use your hands, or was there a natural progression of, yeah, I'm ready for this, let's use my hands?
Yeah, to be honest, it was a relief. When I like first got in and I had my feet near the pedals, or my right foot near the pedals, and then I was like, okay, well, let's not do that. And I pulled my foot away from the pedals and sort of sat like I would in a chair, almost just normally. I was like, okay, good. I don't need to worry about those now. I can just use my hands. These work pretty good. Let's get into it. And yeah, it's sort of become almost like a bit of a challenge. Like, let's try this out and not have fun, but engage with it and explore it fully.
Well, yeah, look, we encourage people to have a bit of fun with it and
Mm,
enjoy the challenge of learning to drive with hand controls, because there's so many options out there in regards to hand controls and counter balancing the lower limb function loss.
mm.
Is there types of hand controls that stood out to you? Were there different, presented with different controls, and did you move towards a set of controls, or wanted to try something but then something else jumped out at you after you had a go? Were there decisions that you had to make, or was it a one-off type of decision?
I guess it was in consultation with the OT at the time and what options were available. I'd done a little bit of Googling and I saw that there were some that were like a stick that comes out from, your instrument stalk sort of thing, and you could push and pull that, and things that mounted to the steering wheel besides just a spinner. And I was kind of, when I actually did the test in the vehicle, I remember feeling at the time, using the throttle and brake, I was like, "Oh, this takes a little bit of effort, like it takes a bit of energy to use that. It feels like like you're pushing a lever like in an old train or something like that. Like there was a bit of resistance there. So I remember thinking that's going to be tiring on my body. And then because of the process and how long it all took with NDIS, Department of Transport, and all that sort of stuff, there was actually a new option that came up while I was sort of waiting, and that was a purely electronic throttle, and that was different. Just almost feels like it's floating, like there's like no mechanical resistance whatsoever. And like I'm really grateful that, yeah, that option ended up being the one that I was able to use and go for.
Yeah. So, for people listening into this, if they want to know what Linton's using the Fardiel Easy Drive, which is a lever action, which is mounted to the floor, and it's a push-pull mechanism that runs down by the left knee, and then he's using his right hand on the steering wheel with a spinner knob. So, and what he's saying is the throttle is electronic rather than any cables or any mechanical levers at all for the accelerator, but brake is still a mechanical lever pushing the brake pedal in, and that's a safety mechanism. If anything goes wrong, then you can use the brake lever to slow the car down in a mechanical sense.
Mm.
Um, Tell us that moment when you actually realized that this could be a safe way to an appropriate way to drive. Was it a light switch? Was it a gradual? Was it a had when did you go, yeah, this is good. This is
I reckon, yeah, is probably a couple of light switch moments there. The first was like the initial test where, I think we probably only drove for, I don't know, 30 minutes to an hour or something, just to try things out and get some input from the OT and everything. And it was during that, I think, that I was just like, okay, this is good. Obviously I've got to play catch up here and get good at driving again using, these different devices and everything. And then it was during the lessons that I was having, and as my competence started to grow and I started to realize, oh, cool, I'm doing this without thinking now. That was like a real, okay, this is a relief. It's not something that I'm going to have to, think about for a great deal of time to really try and, become proficient at this. It really only took maybe 2 or 3 hours of practice to start at least to feel that way. Obviously now, months later, I feel a lot more confident with it, and I'm kind of at that stage where I don't have to think about it. But yeah, it was those moments when I started to realize, okay, I'm going to get as good at this as I was at driving before, and then I don't have to think about it anymore. I can just move on, and yeah.
And comparing it to when you were driving with your feet in those, let's say 2020 onwards,
Yeah.
2021, 2022, is it chalk and cheese? Is it better now? Do you feel safer? And is it the way that you would recommend for other people that are umming and ahhing?
Yeah, for sure. As I said before, I had that sort of like low grade anxiety about driving and everything, but I think at the time I didn't really realize that. Like I knew that, things were changing in my body and it would be the best course of action to make some changes to be able to drive safe and effectively and all that sort of stuff. And, you worry about, oh, what if something happens and it's not even my fault? And then, there might be some investigation and, I could get in some trouble or something like that, So there was a lot of, I guess, worry about that. Um, but then when I got the hand controls and started to drive confidently, it was like, I was actually quite anxious and worried about driving before, and it feels bloody good to not have those feelings anymore, to just, know that, everything's been done properly. I've been checked off as competent to use the hand controls. I feel confident. Um, and it's just amazing to not have to worry about that anymore.
Yeah, that's a great sensation, I'm sure. And just to unpack what Linton went through in South Australia, where you are, the OT assessment that you did was like a prescription assessment, like getting a wheelchair, I guess, prescribing the right piece of equipment to help meet your needs. And then you went on a lesson process to get used to it. And then in South Australia, you have to do a Department of Transport final drive. What was that drive like? Was it nerve wracking? What was that final tick off? Because it's not your P's test. It's not your L's going for your P's and becoming an independent driver for the first time. But I've heard along the way that it is as nerve wracking. What was it like for you?
Yeah, it was a little bit nerve wracking. The most difficult thing was, I guess, for me, through the whole process, probably one of the real challenging points was dealing with the Department of Infrastructure and Transport, just because they had a real backlog, and if you called up to query anything, it's just like keep waiting sort of thing. So it was just this real bureaucratic sort of process where there's nothing you can really do about it. And by the time that it finally did come around, the inspector or government representative showed up, and he was like, "Oh, how did you get here today?" And I was like, "Oh, well, I drove my car, my car with my great hand controls that I absolutely love that I've been driving for a little while now." And he's like, "Oh, you're not allowed to do that." And I was like, "What do you mean?" And he's like, "Well, I've got here a temporary license that says you can only drive with a government official." And I was like, I don't think that's right. And, straight away, the anxiety is just like spiking. I'm like, oh my God, what have I done here?
Mhm.
But anyway, he made a couple of calls and was just like, everything's fine. My paperwork wasn't in order, sort of thing. And this process is a bit different. Let's crack on. So that sort of set the stage to start out, I guess, with a bit of anxiety. But yeah, like 20 minutes in, I think I started to feel fine again. I had a good guy there that was doing the appraisal and everything, and we were having a chat about his experience in that space and the sorts of things that he's seen over the years. And yeah, it was okay. It's just in that setting, I guess, the worrying about the rules comes up again, because that is something that he's looking at as well. So I was like, okay, yeah, I need to be mindful and do everything 100% by the book here. But yeah, it wasn't too bad. There was a little bit of anxiety there, but nothing too bad. Too bad.
Yeah, Linton didn't have his license suspended through any of this process, and that's where the auditor auditor's mindset was coming from, that it was suspended through this process. So
Mm.
there's a little bit of a different story for Lynton, and why he was able to drive to his assessment beforehand. We'll go back and have a little bit of a chat about the NDIS,
Mm.
and how that's been involved in all of this process.
Mhm.
Burden, good, bad, ugly. How's the NDIS fitted in this story for you, Linton?
It's been all of those things that you've just mentioned, I think, at various different points. Um, but yeah, I started to explore NDIS in, I think it was 2020, and got my first plan. And to be honest, like the process of getting into the NDIS and approval and all that sort of stuff was surprisingly smooth for me. I think a lot of that was because, I had been exploring things medically and had reports and evidence and all that sort of stuff that had built up over a period of time. And I also had a GP who was familiar with the process and knew which language to use in her reports and references and all that sort of stuff. So it did take some months, and then, but once it was happening, I was like surprised at the level of support that I had and the funding and all that sort of stuff. I was like, this is great. Um, but then after 1 year, I got to my first plan review, and that's where things started to go awry. And at this point in time, I wasn't yet at the stage where I was exploring hand controls. But basically, when my plan got renewed, a bunch of funding was cut. This would have been in 2021. Um, and I think that experience is pretty common for people around about that time, especially. And I asked for certain things, they rejected them in the plan, and I thought, well, all of this stuff seems reasonable and necessary, to quote NDIA. So I would like to appeal it. And got into an administrative appeals tribunal, which dragged on for about 10 months or so. And
Mm,
I think I was about the 6 months in stage where I was like, okay, this is when I need hand controls. So basically, what that meant was having that discussion when I was on the phone with the AAT and the NDIA's lawyers. Basically saying, look, I need hand controls. What's the go? And they're like, yep, let's wrap that into this conversation as well. So that's when I started to book in to get an appraisal done and all that sort of stuff.
yeah. Do you think the hand controls, and do you think you'd be driving without the NDIS right now, in regards to cost, in regards to how much you've been through, and the assessment process, the lessons, the cost of actually putting in the hand controls to your car? Do you think it's been worth it in regards to the NDIS?
Yeah, I think so. It has been a lot of work, and at times very stressful and emotional and difficult. Just working. I think the biggest challenge is working with people that are able-bodied and don't have any lived experience of disability, and just some of the questions that come up and stuff like that just make you scratch your head, and just like, you don't really have any idea about what it's like to be in this sort of space with these sorts of changes going on. But overall worth it. Like if I had to go through the whole process without any funding, I would have probably modified my old car, which was quite dated and would have meant probably having to use mechanical sort of hand controls instead of the new sort of electric ones. But because NDIS funded those hand controls, I was in a financial position where I was like, well, first of all, NDIS wouldn't fund hand controls in an older vehicle anyway. So I was like, well, I guess it's time to upgrade. And with COVID and everything at the time, the used car market was just
Well,
terrible.
yeah,
So I
been through
was
that
like,
as well.
well, yeah, I was like, first time in my life, I always said I would never buy a brand new car, but it seems like the best option at this point in time. And in retrospect,
Mm.
I'm very glad that I did because I love the vehicle, and with the hand controls, it works very well. So, yeah, to answer the question, if I had to fund it all myself, I would still probably be in an older car for sure.
Yeah. Any advice that you want to give to people that are going through this process? Is there anything that you could tell people that want to follow in your footsteps?
Start early, 100%. Just because there's going to be blind spots and things that come up that are going to cause delays, 100%. That's what happened to me. A
Mhm.
few things that I felt that I did really by the book sort of thing, and I thought this should be fine. But no, things come out, and Department of Transport was sort of like, oh, this paperwork wasn't done 100% correctly. You need to resubmit. That means you're back to the start of the queue, stuff like that. So yeah, started early, get the appraisal early, and then just get the ball rolling on it. Because it's just a lifesaver, like being able to drive without any anxiety and making sure that you're doing things legally, and that if anything were to happen, whether it's your fault or not, that you've ticked all the boxes and you've done everything the right way, is just, I don't have to worry about it anymore, and that's priceless.
Yeah, great way to wrap it up. I can't believe time's flown already. We've just ticked over 40 minutes in regards to this interview. So I really want to thank you for your time. But before we wind up, we always ask our guests one final question, and we don't let anyone get away with it, even if it. But before we do, we just want to do another quick acknowledgement of our sponsors that make this show possible: Mobility Engineering and Williams OT. Lynton, we've learned over this podcast that cars really are more than just getting from A to B, and they have so much meaning behind them to open up life and freedom and things like that. Is there an event in your life where, even if it's before you got the hand controls, or it can be after, is there something that you've used your car for, an adventure or something stupid or something that stands out in your memory that you've used your car for that you want to share with us today?
Yeah, I guess probably one of the more memorable things that happened was, I used to be quite interested in cars and performance cars, a while ago when I was a bit younger, and I had my heart set on getting an Audi S3, and there weren't too many of them around in Adelaide, so I started to look in other states and stuff, and all my mates and stuff at the time, and partner and stuff, which is like, what are you doing? This is crazy. But I ended up finding one in Melbourne, and I started the process over the phone to try and secure that vehicle, and it was owned by, I'm not a big sports guy, but it was owned by someone called John Bow, and he's like a
Yeah.
big race guy and well known in the industry, and apparently like the gentleman of motorsport and all this sort of
Yeah.
stuff. And
Yeah.
you know, I was
V8
quite
supercar
nervous.
driver.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I was quite nervous about pulling the trigger on the car and everything, because I hadn't seen it and all that sort of stuff. And I was like, how do I know that? He asked for a deposit, and I'm like, oh, how do I know that this is all going to go okay? And he's just like, I'm John Bow. And I was just like, had to ask my mates what that meant, and they were like, "It's fine, don't worry about it.
Yeah.
He's a legend." So
The
anyway, I
car's
flew
going to be
over.
well looked after. It's going
Yeah,
to be looked
exactly.
after
Yeah,
by him. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So flew over, got the car, and then drove it back along the Great Ocean Road. And I think that was just, a really great memory and a great time.
Yeah, and that's if you go right back to our very first podcast interview with Qua, that's his passion, his car of choice as well, and he's doing with his prosthetic legs and so forth. He's racing his car and he's drifting
Awesome.
it, and he's doing quarter miles, and he's doing all kinds of stuff. So it seems to be the car of choice to have a
Brilliant.
bit of fun with. Mate, Lynton, you're a legend. A huge thanks to you. Thanks very much for coming on board. I know you. I'm going to put that out there so people understand. I know you and helped you in the process, but I've learnt from you all the way through, and I've learnt even more today. So I want to thank you very much for coming on and taking the time for today. And I'm hoping that our listeners get something out of it as well. If they've got any questions, would you be happy if they contacted us directly to put them in contact with you, or are you on socials or anything else like
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, happy to speak about, disability and the journey, and always happy to help people. They can look me up on socials and, Facebook and all that sort of stuff. Be happy to have a chat. But yeah, if they want to reach out to you too, that's fine.
Yeah, no worries. All right, awesome. So we'll put the contacts in the show notes for those social feeds if people want to get in contact. But thanks again. We really appreciate your time and energy today, and we like I said, I'm really thankful, and we hope our listeners get something out of it about how to make that decision of when to move to hand controls. And stick around, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to reflect on this interview and do the top 3 takeaways. Ali's not here, so it's just my top 3 takeaways today. But we'll reflect on all of those things that were discussed in the interview. So stick around, and as we say, goodbye to Lynton. Thanks very much.
Thanks for having me, Brad. It was great.
Excellent. Thanks, mate.
Cheers.
All right, welcome back. In this section, we normally have Ali and I bringing you our top 3 takeaways with our over 30 years of joint experience, but today it's just me. And this time I've got about 20 years in the industry. So you've got about 20 years worth of knowledge in today's top 3 takeaways. What the first takeaway that I want to reflect on from the interviews is how people compensate when they've got a disability and they've been driving. So, and that's one of the main reasons why I got Lynton on, because he's really open in talking about how he was driving before he made the decision to explore hand controls. He was looking at his feet and using his peripheral vision to look at his feet, and using a method of hitting the side wall of the cabin to know that he was over the accelerator, but then honesty as well, and that it was getting difficult to suppress the brake. Um, it's interesting how people do compensate to keep that freedom and independence when they are driving, and when they've got that license, it just opens up the world to be able to have the freedom to go where you want. And people will do all kinds of things to make sure that they keep that freedom. And we know that, there's people that later on in life, when they're getting older and their kids want to take away the keys from the car, but they still find a way to be able to drive and get down to the shops and keep that independence. It means so much to have that license. I mean, I couldn't imagine my life if the license was taken away from me through a disability. And we do what we can, but is it safe? That's the question we have to be asking ourselves. Is it safe to continue on this way? Because what we learned through this interview with Lynton is, and leads us into our second takeaway point, is that it's a long process to go through to look at alternatives. It's also can be nerve-wracking, can be a little bit anxiety provoking. It's like going back to the start again, like you're a 16-year-old, going back to that time again, and that can be extremely nerve-wracking to do that. I mean, I've been doing this for many years, and through lived experience of helping lots and lots of participants and lots of clients, that's a very common theme that comes through, is that people are anxious and nervous about this process because it means so much. Having that license question has so much meaning behind it. And, they've been questioned as a person, they've been questioned about their disability, they've been questioned about their ability to actually drive. And I know if I was questioned about that, that would provoke a lot of anxiety in me as well. What Lynton also talked about was how long the process takes with NDIS funding, getting it approved, going through the Department of Transport, medical certificates. There's so many steps involved. If you want to understand the steps involved, go back to episode 41, where I unpack my role as an occupational therapist and talk through that process of how many different arms are involved in the assessment process. But it's worth it, and that's our third takeaway here, is that Lynton expressed that he's driving without worry now. He's driving with that real freedom and real independence to get in the car when he wants and go wherever he wants, and do that with safety, and is driving with all the boxes ticked, was his words. He knows that he's driving with no question and no doubt over his driving, and that's a burden that's been lifted out of his head. So that's the three top takeaways that we wanted to reflect on, or I wanted to reflect on after this interview today, is that people compensate a lot to keep that ability to be able to drive, and sometimes it may not be appropriate. The process is complicated. We're not going to shy away from that, and it is long-winded. And there's many steps that you have to go through to get all those boxes ticked. But as we learned from Lynton, is that it's worth it. He can drive without that worry. All the boxes are ticked, and he can drive wherever he wants, whenever he wants, knowing that he's doing it in a safe way, and that he's doing it in an appropriate way. And that brings us to an end of this episode. We want to give a shout out to our sponsors, Mobility Engineering and Williams OT, that help us bring you these interviews. And just to recap on who these great companies are, Williams OT do driver assessments and rehab and offer all the pieces of the puzzle to assist people with disability reach their driving and community mobility goals. And talking about mobility engineering is a team of passionate and dedicated people focused on bringing Australia's largest range of suitable transport solution for all walks of life. And as we say in every episode, the advice provided in this podcast is general in nature. So if you have any queries about what can work for you, make sure you get in contact with your local OT or mobility dealer and set yourself up with a trial, because as we say in every episode, trials really do put you in the driver's seat. That's it for today. I want to do a shout out to Ali, who couldn't join us today, but he'll be back next week. And make sure that you tune into that episode where we'll have another great interview unpacking disability and driving. We'll see you then. Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to the Drive Able podcast with Brad Williams and Ali Akbarian. If you like what you've heard, make sure you like, rate and subscribe. It really does make a massive difference. If you or anyone you know would like to share a story about driving with a disability, or you would like to get in contact, find the show notes, or find the resources mentioned in this episode, you can find us on Facebook. Just search @Drive Able Podcast for more information.